welcome to another episode of The Crafting Slab. Today we're going to be talking about the case of Sarah Dazley
while making some air dry clay Christmas crafts.
Shall we get started?
Let's go. So these are the bits we're going to be using today for the craft. I've just got some air dry white clay, a few different stampers and some cutters, scissors, paintbrush, twine, and then a bit later on we'll be decorating with paints, and we've got some glitter here as well. So shall I make a start? And
and we'll start talking about the case of the Potton Poisoner. So Sarah Dazley, I'm pronouncing it Dazley because I knew someone with a similar surname. So I apologise if I'm pronouncing it wrong, but I'm going to go with that pronunciation. Now I've started. So Sarah Dazley, she was born in 1819 in Potton, Bedfordshire. So it was her place of birth that gave her the moniker of the Potton Poisoner, rather than where the crime actually happened, which was about 5 or 6 miles away. She grew up in the town and was well known as the daughter of the barber. There's little information on her early life other than that, and other than the fact that her father died when she was 7. At 19, she wanted to start a family of her own, and she married Simeon Mead and lived in Potton for 2 years. Then in around 1840, moved to Tadlow, which is about 4.5 miles away. They moved there with Simeon's teenage daughter Anne from his first marriage, and it was there that she gave birth to her son Jonah. After, you would think after that she would, she'd have a happy life. She's got her nice husband, who was reportedly a very nice man, her lovely son. But unfortunately, Jonah became ill and died at the age of 7 months old.
Oh.
It was not uncommon for there to be infant deaths at that time. But what was strange was the death of her husband, which was unexpected and only a few months later. So the following year
that could be put down to really bad luck, couldn't it? At the time,
exactly.
Like your child dies and your husband dies, and I suppose medicine's there and medical treatment isn't the same as now.
Exactly, and there's reports at the time of people dying from grief.
Yeah,
it's not and melancholy was still a diagnosis at the time. So even though it would be very unusual now, and I'd say there's very few deaths that can't be explained, it wasn't unusual at the time. But only a year later, in 1841, Sarah married again to William Dazley, and they moved to the village of Wrestlingworth, again another few miles away. So really, it's really all within the very local Bedfordshire area. She invited Anne to live with them, who was the daughter of her previous husband, but William didn't like this idea at all, and after their marriage he became a heavy drinker and reportedly beat both Sarah and Anne, blaming them for all his troubles.
Oh God.
However, after William became ill, it was Sarah and Anne who were forced to look after him, and Anne took on the lion's share of the care. He was seen by the local doctor, and initially the prescriptions worked, and William began to show signs of improvement. However, Sarah began making pills of her own for her husband. And again, making pills of your own is perhaps a little strange, but making tinctures and home remedies would be a very common practice in those days. So she began making her own pills to give to William, and it was Anne Mead because Anne Mead was doing most of the caring for William, and she trusted what Sarah was doing right, so much that when William refused to take the new pills that Sarah had made, Anne took one herself to show him there was nothing to worry about, not knowing that they contained arsenic trioxide. So I presume that Sarah didn't know that Anne was going to take the pills, but it did actually convince William to take them. So modern uses for the compound arsenic trioxide include pesticides and manufacturing glass, but in those days you could just buy it at the pharmacy. You did need a reason to buy it in the quantities that she would have needed, so she would likely have said that she was using it to kill rats or mice, to get enough to kill her husband. After taking Sarah's pills, Anne Mead became very ill with similar symptoms to William, vomiting and stomach pains. So after, like I said, after taking Sarah's pills, Anne Mead became very ill, and William eventually was won over and decided to take his wife's lethal drugs, and he passed away on the 30th of October 1842, so just a year after they married. After his death, suspicion rose against Dazley over the death of her two husbands and son. Obviously, there were a lot of deaths at that time, but it was very suspicious that she'd lost everybody close to her. So William Dazley's body was examined and found to contain traces of arsenic, and an arrest warrant was issued for Sarah Dazley, who fled to London. Superintendent Blunden of Biggleswade Police, Biggleswade, any of you watching for Biggleswade, tracked her down, and she insisted she was innocent and had no idea about any poisonings or why any evidence had been discovered in the house she shared with her late husband, William. She was arrested and returned to Bedford, where the news of William's death had caused suspicion regarding her first husband, Simeon Mead, and their baby son, Jonah. So their bodies were exhumed and tested for traces of arsenic.
Oh, goodness.
And it was found in baby Jonah, but Simeon's body was too decomposed to test.
Oh, goodness. So she murdered
her baby with arsenic as well. So he would have been pretty sick before he passed away. You know, tiny little baby vomiting like that. It's just awful. So on March the 24th, 1843, Sarah Dazley was remanded at Bedford Jail to await her trial. And Bedford Jail at the time, spelled Gaol, so very old school spelling of the word. It was over 3 buildings and it was absolutely enormous. It had all kinds of different outbuildings, and it spanned quite a large area in Bedford. Obviously, most of that is gone now. But it'd be interesting to see if we could find something. We'll put a link in the description.
Is it in the same place as the current jail is in Bedford?
I'm not sure. But we'll find the information and we'll put a link to see if we can find a map. So she was remanded at Bedford Jail to await trial, and she used the time to work on her defences. The first defence that she tried was that William poisoned himself. And the second was that William had poisoned Jonah and Simeon, and she poisoned William as revenge for murdering them.
It's a bit of a stretch.
It is a bit of a stretch. Especially because you would just poison him. You wouldn't marry him first.
Yeah.
If he murdered your husband and child. So her trial began on the 22nd of July, and she was ultimately convicted for the murder of her husband, William. She wasn't tried for the murder of her son, Jonah, but the investigation was kept open just in case the first trial resulted in an unlikely innocent verdict. So she wasn't ever actually convicted of that murder, but they know she definitely did do it. A number of people testified against Sarah, including the chemist she bought the arsenic from, Anne Mead, and their neighbour, Mrs. Carver, and they all gave pretty damning evidence to suggest Sarah did little to hide her intentions. At the time, they used a test called the Marsh test to detect the arsenic in William Dazley's body, and the result was used as forensic evidence against Dazley. I know we said in our previous video that the term forensic evidence seems like a quite new, relatively new term, but it's used to describe many things. So,
I mean, science of any kind of science always, comes a long way over time. So, although forensic evidence isn't like it is now, it doesn't mean it wasn't used.
No, I didn't.
In some way.
I just didn't realise the term was used at all. But they did, anything available, from handwriting or specks of blood on clothing, or even like pieces of cloth. In the Jack the Ripper case, they found a piece of cloth that didn't belong to one of the victims, and ultimately said that belonged to Jack the Ripper. They had his handwriting, or they suspect they had his handwriting. They don't actually know who wrote the letters to the police. But yeah, it's just that now most cases rely on a strong forensic evidence to get conviction. And obviously, like you said, the methods have come a long way and they've become more complicated. And we've discovered new ways of identifying, who murderers are and who their victims potentially are, and identifying bodies. So it only took 30 minutes for the jury to convict Dazley of murder. And that seems to be quite a common thread in the 1800s, that they really don't take very much time to consider whether they're guilty or not. Baron Alderson sentenced Sarah to death by public hanging, and she was executed on Saturday the 5th of August 1843 at Bedford Jail. She was the only woman to be publicly hanged at Bedford Jail, and thousands of people came to watch the execution, and she became known as the Potton Poisoner. The cottage where Sarah Dazley murdered William is still standing today, and we'll put a link in the description to photographer Kieran Welch's website, where you can see the photos. He takes photographs of the locations of crimes, historical crimes, in his portfolio named Conflict, Memory and Landscape. It's a really, really interesting website. And she was actually back in the papers in 2020 when a clay seal, hence the link, was found, and it had the date of her execution and her initials, and it was sold at auction for £2,250.
Wow.
So it seems like in those days it was some kind of souvenir from the hanging.
Okay.
They could have like the location of the hanging, and it was on like a ring, almost like it would be put on a keychain or something.
Key ring souvenir.
Yeah. I had a quote from, again, I'm sorry about pronunciation, but I believe it's Joanne Richards, who said, souvenirs of this type are rare survivals. While they may have been reasonably plentiful in Victorian society, they are easily lost because of their size and can obviously be considered rather macabre objects. I don't like the word macabre. I think it suggests that there's an unnatural fascination with death, but I think anybody can be curious as long as you're not doing it to people yourself. So anyway, we'll put the details in the description of the article where we found this information. And Sarah was ultimately buried at Bedford Jail. So we found her memorial ID, and but unfortunately, because of the time period, and it's been such a long time, mostly everything else has been lost. So unless you were to search local graveyards of each and every grave, I think it's unlikely you'd find the grave of her or her victims. The graves of Simeon Mead and Jonah Mead, they were buried together, are apparently still there in local to Potton, but again, the information's been lost. So it's the interesting case of the Potton Poisoner.
Very interesting.
So thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed the case of the Potton Poisoner.
And the crafts of the clay Christmas decorations.
So how long would the decorations take to dry?
So this air dry clay in particular takes a few days to dry. I think most of them are pretty similar, taken a couple of days to dry. And then once they're dry, you can decorate them with paint or glitter or make them as Christmassy as you like.
That sounds great. And as you've seen, we've decorated our Christmas tree.
Yeah,
but
they can also be used for making little tags for presents and all sorts of Christmassy display things, or all year round if that's what you like.
Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Bye.